All right. So there's Bridget.
Yeah, I think that everything's like really splotchy as your listener. As a speaker, we can hear clearly, and that's what the problem is. They're cutting you out, Colonel Towner.
No kidding, Stellar.
And they're doing it to all the speakers. I was trying to listen on my way home. Sorry, didn't mean to jump in. But I could hear and it's not your microphone. And it's all the speakers. But you would just hear like a few words and then nothing. And then a few words and then nothing.
Well, I'm glad they're sharing the wealth now. Because up until you just said that, I've never been in another space. And I go in spaces all the time where I couldn't hear the speaker ever.
It's your space, Colonel Towner.
Well, evidently they're sharing the wealth now. So maybe other people are starting to tell the truth.
That would be a nice change, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
This is the same guy that wants to do banking here. Sorry.
All right. So we're going to continue with President's Secret Wars. And this one, the chapter 5 is Covert Legions, which is kind of apropos right now. It shouldn't take us very long. All right. The Washington Center of Secret Wars was awash with studies and proposals and plans. Such operations as the Albanian one that we talked about and the China one that we talked about, from those not corrupt CIA people, were only the tip of the iceberg. During the Truman administration, more precisely during the Korean War, the organizations and procedures for paramilitary operations were created, standardized, and used often. There was swirling controversy around the White House about their use. There was bickering back and forth between the CIA and the Pentagon. And for President Truman, the problem was to stimulate covert operations while maintaining their secrecy. Because that's what you do in a republic, is keep secrets from the voters who are supposed to cast an informed vote about all the shit you're keeping secret from them. The CIA, at CIA, the question was who would direct the covert actions within the agency and who would be their commander. Over the Pentagon, the military was concerned about how they would interrelate with the CIA during paramilitary operations, because they're not supposed to ever take directions from anybody not in their chain of command. President Truman's problem was simplest at the beginning. At that time, he approved that NSC that we talked about before, called 10-2 in 1948. It seemed natural to oversee closely any kind of sensitive endeavor. That summer, there were 3 NSC meetings that specifically dealt with the Office of Special Projects, which was the forerunner to Frank Wisner's covert operations. But the president could not plausibly deny knowledge if he attended the meeting. Truman resorted to a special panel as a subordinate entity to the NSC 10-2 activities, composed of the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, plus representatives from each of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, so they too can have plausible deniability. They just assign an underling, like their deputy or a division chief, to go to those meetings so they can plan on killing people around the world, and the big guys don't have to get their hands dirty. Only disagreements among the panel were to be referred to the full NSC, because then they couldn't deny deniability. The first departmental representative was George Keenan for state. Colonel Ivan Yeaton, Yeaton, for the Pentagon. The degree of cooperation achieved by this panel is suggested by the lack of any record of any of them talking to the full NSC. Yet the cooperation also meant the lack of the opportunity for the president to see anything that they were doing. 81 covert actions were initiated during the Truman's tenure, by the Director of Intelligence on his authority after consultation with this subpanel under 10-2 and its successor under 10-5. Without frequent discussions with the NSC, President Truman was forced to rely directly on his Director of Intelligence and whatever he told him. During the earliest era, when the Central Intelligence Group, this is prior to the CIA actually forming, was run out of a 3-room office next door to the White House, some sort of indirect administration might have been possible. However, once you move them off site, which they did, and you've created these layers of buffer in between of you and them, none of that occurred. In Washington, there was some temporary construction office buildings set up that had originally housed the OSS during the war. After the formation of the CIA, its headquarters was placed in the OSS building because the OSS had been deactivated. From there, Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter became the DCI and presided over the inception of American covert operations. If there was anyone who could have expected to be aware of the danger of another Pearl Harbor-ish type activity, it was Hillenkotter. He was an Annapolis man. He had been executive officer aboard the USS West Virginia that Sunday morning in December. Dressing in his cabin when the attack began, Hillenkotter could not even reach the quarterdeck of his ship before it began sinking. He returned to the Pacific later in the war to create a functioning joint intelligence center for the theater commander in only 6 months' time. And the theater commander at the time would have been who? MacArthur. Hillenkotter had been appointed DCI in May of 1948. It did not harm his chances that he was fluent in 3 languages. He had served as a naval attaché in Paris, which that's interesting because that's exactly where they set up NATO originally. Hillenkotter was also an associate of Admiral William Leahy, who at the time was advising President Truman on intelligence. And by the way, it was Leahy. I read that in another book that recommended this guy for the DCI. There were many conflicts between Hillenkotter in the main office and Frank Wisner, who ran his fiefdom from a different building. Intelligence authorities like Ray Klein argue that Hillenkotter lacked the rank, prestige, and political clout to lead the CIA into high gear performance. But the NSC 10-2 created an ambiguous administrative situation for Frank Wisner. With his authority from the NSC and his policy directives from the 10-2, Frank Wisner could draw expenses from the CIA while shielding his activities from the CIA, hiding behind either the State Department or the Defense Department whenever he needed to. Frank Wisner, being an OSS person, drew on the knowledge and support of friends throughout his network. Wisner thus had many advantages in the contest for bureaucratic power within the CIA. In other words, it didn't matter that somebody was his boss. The foremost among those, White House interest in aggressive prosecution of the Cold War would give him plenty of cover. So then, around this same time, you had Allen Dulles, Jackson, and Carrera write a report on exactly what the post-OSS intelligence arrangement needed to be. And weirdly enough, it looked exactly like the CIA ended up looking. That was reviewed by President Truman in 1940. I think so they set up the Central Intelligence Group. Then they hired this report, and then they created the CIA. And then, of course, they all end up being in the CIA. The OPC field stations increased from 7 to 47. Personnel to about 6,000 by 1952. And 1952 would have been in the middle of the Korean War, just prior to overthrowing Iran, and they've already overthrown a couple of governments by then. So slightly more than half of them were overseas contract personnel. About half of the OPC, which is Wisner's area, worked for the Far East Division, meaning helping Chiang Kai-shek. German operations employed another 12,000. Just between fiscal year 50 and 51, Frank Wisner's office multiplied from 584 to 1,531, which is basically 3 times. And the majority of them were paramilitary people. Some observers believe that the publicized budget figures of $82 million in 52 was not high enough. And Wisner was spending a lot of that in Eastern Europe, which of course is where they were recruiting all of the former Nazis that had skinned babies alive. That was including the Ukrainian, the Croatians. Remember that whole story in the World Anti-Communist League? Yeah. So he's paying all of them with the budget. In any case, clandestine collections and covert operations were by then absorbing 60% of the CIA personnel and 74% of the budget. When Roscoe Hillenkotter was gone, he turned to a sea command, a cruiser division in the Pacific, and reached Korean waters soon enough to lead the ship, giving gunfight support to the U.S. Marines in the evacuation after China reasserted itself in the northern part of Korea. The new DCI was General Walter Bedell Smith, who assumed office in October 7th, 1950. Beetle, which was his nickname, had the prestige and contacts that Hillenkotter lacked. General Smith had been General Dwight Eisenhower's chief of staff during the war, a field commander afterwards, and an ambassador to Moscow already. Having stood up to Joseph Stalin in the position as the Moscow ambassador, Smith had a lot more prestige. Less than a week after he came on board at the CIA, the new director of intelligence announced that he was unilaterally assuming direct administration of Frank Wisner's office, a change reluctantly accepted by state, defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A couple of months later, when Smith learned that a subordinate actually controlled communications between headquarters and the field stations so that the DCI did not see all of the cables, he threw a fit. He wanted to see everything. Beetle Smith's next move came in January 51 when he got Alan Dulles appointed as deputy director at the CIA. As such, he was supposed to manage both Frank Wisner and the Office of Special Operations, which gathered the clandestine intelligence. Dulles was perhaps the best OSS spy, famous for all of his work in Switzerland during the war in arranging the surrender of German armies in northern Italy at the end of the war. A lawyer by trade, Dulles had been active in politics and government to include the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, and had authored books of his exploits. He was the author of the NSC -50 study, basically setting up the whole structure. The merger idea was known as a fusion project. Both Wisner and the OSI director, who at that time was General Willard Wyman, were known to be in favor of it. So was Lyman Kirkpatrick, an executive assistant to the DCI. Smith had been approached regarding the subject of CIA legal counsel Lawrence Houston even before he took over. but there were many differences over how fusion ought to be accomplished. So, in August of 1951, on a trial basis, they basically took the Western Hemisphere divisions of both offices and put them together, of the OSS and the OPC, just to see how it would work. Fuse them together. The last straw came in 1952 as a byproduct of the Lee-Me partisan operation. The OPC, Wisner's branch, was in Bangkok and tried to recruit a senior CIA officer away from the other directorate. This led to open dissension between them. So, as it ends up, they fuse the whole thing together, and Frank Wisner ends up being the boss of the entire operation. As the Wurlitzer, called jukebox, Wisner, he was called the Wurlitzer because he played everybody like a piano, was quite interested in propaganda and psychological warfare and anything that was secret or black, including operations and propaganda. And he also had what was referred to as gray propaganda and operations as well. And the same support that Wisner had lent to the Committee for a Free Europe, which was the balloon leaflet effort, was going to be now applied in many different areas. An Asian version of Radio Free Europe was set up where? Oh, in Taiwan, and beamed across mainland China. There was evidence of CIA complicity in subsidizing publications, labor movements, youth movements, public interest groups, including the Committee of 1 Million Against the Admission of Communist China into the UN. The propaganda effort was nothing if not global in scope. So, what do you see today that the CIA is involved in via National Endowment for Democracy and USAID? The exact same thing. News media, labor movements, youth movements, and public interest groups. Pursuing these programs, Wisner was simply following orders from Harry Truman, a president deeply interested in psychological warfare as well. Truman held the belief that psychological warfare was insufficient, an insufficiently appreciated resource. In February 1949, he ordered the creation of the State Department's Psychological Warfare Office. So it was started in the State Department, and Frank Wisner was in the State Department before he moved over to the CIA. And that tells you what we've been saying for decades at this, prior to the CIA, not decades that we've been doing this. But remember, we were talking about how basically the mafia and the oligarchs worked hand in hand with the State Department in overthrowing governments before the CIA was created. They just moved that arrangement along with their lawyers like Allen Dulles into the CIA to continue doing the exact same thing. The CIA's never been about intelligence at all, none. The intelligence aspect of it is focused in supporting oligarchs, not the country, which is why they go around overthrowing governments on behalf of the oligarchs and not us. Because technically, we don't need anybody government overthrown. NSC 59 established a staff for psychological operations within the State Department and appropriated responsibility to state and Pentagon. Truman approved orders for a, quote, plan for national psychological warfare when he signed NSC 74. He also asked Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, Sours, to return as a consultant and review non-military Cold War activities. Sowers learned that suggestions were afloat for the creation of an interagency group in this area, responsible directly to the president and the NSC. The former DCI supported the recommendation, to which Truman responded by setting up a Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, under the NSC in the spring of '51. That fall, in approving the NSC 10-5, the president gave the PSB membership on the 10-5 panel supporting covert operations. The creation of PSB marked a significant milestone in the escalation of secret warfare, which now would include propaganda. But those operations were conducted on a more or less ad hoc basis with little formal interagency coordination. Now the PSB would be brainstorming comprehensive propaganda plans supporting both the military and the CIA, planning for propaganda and psychological warfare, and later monitoring national efforts in that area was the job of a PSB staff office. The first staff director that Truman chose was Gordon Gray, Gray, Gordon. And I would love to know whether Gordon Gray is related to our other Gray that ran the PR firm that also ran a prostitution ring in Washington, D.C. under the guise of being a PR guy. Who had, so Gordon Gray had previously sat on the president's NSC while serving as the Secretary of the Army. Isn't that sweet? He was known to Frank Wisner and also CIA Deputy Director William Jackson. All of them had worked in the same Wall Street law firm called Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn before World War II. Gray had, Gray hired as his assistant in this warfare, psychological warfare area, a guy by the name of Tracy Barnes, Barnes. The first comprehensive plan was for Germany. It was completed and sent to the PSB in the summer of 1952. Now, keep in mind, this is still the time when Reinhard Gehlen is the chief of intel at the BND for West Germany. So they also set up one for Korea. And despite all of its ambitious aims, the PSB encountered bureaucratic opposition to psychological warfare planning at just about every turn. Truman had previously established the PSB, and they often found it difficult to get the interagency cooperation that was necessary in order to carry out their mission. Gordon Gray may have been a friend of Wisner's, but the CIA man was a seasoned bureaucrat infighter and guarded his territory vigorously. In late December 51, Gray was forced to appeal to Walter Bedell Smith to send CIA representatives to the PSB office for meetings. Gray also sent Smith copies of his informational briefings on what their psychological warfare objectives were in hopes that the CIA would help. In mid-1952, the DCI Smith was still reacting angrily to continued claims that the CIA support for the PSB remained inadequate. In particular, some PSB planners felt the CIA had not developed sufficient information on political differences among Soviet leaders and considered requesting a special national intelligence estimate on that specific subject in order to prepare a PSB plan to put in place upon the death of Stalin. So, all of the high-level interest and the encouragement of President Truman and the advice of psychological warfare experts like Paul Linebarger had not created the techniques above a relatively crude stage of development. At an early plan for the psychological offensive against the Soviet Union, for example, is studded with moralistic rhetoric that sounds more like a collection of homilies and wild themes. The three objectives in this plan were to emphasize to Soviet rulers and people the reckless nature of their policy, to establish goodwill between the people, and to widen the differences thought to exist between the Soviet people and their rulers. The propaganda theme suggested to each of these objectives included the following: the attempts of all tyrants to conquer the world have always failed. Truth, mercy, pity, charity, you got to love this. Love of family, hospitality are some of the basic values which have always been dear to the Soviet people and every other person in whose government we went in and overthrew. There's a bunch of more jargon, but it all sounds basically like that. The close relationship between psychological warfare and covert operations is further demonstrated by the composition of the strategy boards themselves. An early representative of the Secretary of Defense was the guy named John Magruder, who had managed many covert operations for the OSS and the Pentagon's SSU. The DCI was CIA's delegate, Frank Wisner, and representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff was Rear Admiral Leslie Stevens, Stevens, who had also handled military participation in covert operations at the Pentagon. Rather than restraining and coordinating propaganda activities, the Psychological Strategy Board Harry Truman created instead became a stimulant for the intensification of the Cold War, which was its entire purpose. Gordon Gray's appointment at the PSB came unexpectedly. Son of a president of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, Gray had the luxury of being able to devote himself to selfless public service because he was a millionaire. A North Carolina state senator, both before and after the war, an assistant secretary at the Pentagon, and then secretary of the Army, Gray left government service in 1950 to preside over the University of North Carolina. A few short months after his arrival on Capitol Hill, Walter Bedell Smith and William H. Jackson came down from CIA to extend Truman's offer to head PSB. Smith said he wanted Gray to succeed him as the DCI, and working at the PSB would make him the logical choice. Besides, said Smith, the president is serious about setting this up, and we think that you'd be well equipped to do it. Gordon Gray was, in fact, a logical choice for the director of the board. During the war, he had worked at the broadcast section of the European High Command in Luxembourg, setting up a similar Radio Free Europe communication center. Because of hold on. Goodness. I just swallowed wrong. Hold on.
Love you.
Ah. All right, let's keep going. Because of his position, Gray began to spend half of his work week in the Capitol, and he kept going back to North Carolina because he had left so suddenly. So he's not even there half the time. And they were using funds drawn away from the Pentagon and the CIA basically to set up this unit. Gray was later able to get the PSB into its own building around the corner from Blair House. Service at PSB was the beginning of over 3 decades of association in the intelligence field for Gordon Gray. His discretion and ability became legend, but in the early period, they could not shield him from the interagency struggle between all of the different players. Gray thought the PSB had a charter to put together a plan for the Cold War. So did the Soviet press, judging from their denunciation of him. But Gray's friend, Frank Wisner, refused, while PSB was still at their original office, to make the short walk from his office to attend any of Gray's meetings. As for the State Department, Paul Nitze, Nitze, chief of the policy planning staff there, told Gray, look, you just forget about policy. That's not your business. We'll make the policy and then you can put it in your damn radio. Others had an easier time, namely the military experts that were in the unconventional warfare area, for whom Gray had toiled while still at the Pentagon. In the early post-war years, there was little support for these methods in the armed forces. Army Ranger units and Merrill's Magrooters of Burma fame were disbanded. And